Hello, AP Environmental Science students. Mr. Harrison here. I want to continue our conversation about the living world ecosystems by covering four very important cycles, which are topics 1.4 through 1.7. So I'm going to be talking about carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water. And my learning objective for you is by the end, you should be able to explain some of the steps and also some of the reservoir interactions in these cycles, and have some idea about how humans have altered these cycles and what are some of the consequences. So to begin with, what are some of the basics? Here I have a diagram, and diagrams are really important in understanding these cycles. They provide a model so we can understand how they move. And I use animations kind of to help you remember that ecosystems are constantly in flux. There's always a movement of matter through the system. Sometimes it's an input from the air. Sometimes it's coming from the water. Sometimes those nutrients stay within that ecosystem, but oftentimes they are moving on into the atmosphere or hydrosphere. So some of the basics, we're going to be talking about these key nutrients, which are fundamental for living things on our planet, and they cycle through those ecosystems. How much and the rate of the nutrient flux really determines a lot about how productive an area is and how much life that it can support. And the macronutrients, of course, we're going to talk about is carbon, fundamental for all living things because of its ability to share two valence electrons and form complex polymers. Nitrogen, we're going to be talking mainly about its role in plant growth and algae growth, but it's also, don't forget, it's part of our body as well. Phosphorus, we're going to be talking about that mainly in terms of its input from agriculture and its impact on aquatic ecosystems. And of course, water. Today is a rainy day, rainy Monday, stormy Monday. And water is one of those ones I think we should all have a pretty good idea of what's happening as it cycles. So some key terms that I want you to remember as we talk are sources. So sources are something that gives off a particular nutrient. Usually it's contributing it to either the atmosphere, the lithosphere, or the hydrosphere. A sink is a place where a nutrient would accumulate and it would usually be retained for a period of time, sometimes millions of years. And lastly, a reservoir. And a reservoir is something that contains a particular nutrient, but not necessarily for a very long geological time period. So in this case, example here, I have a carbon cycle, and the source, as we know, fossil fuel burning produces carbon dioxide, be a big source, respiration from microbes and humans. Sinks would be things like down here our fossil fuel pool. So as carbon becomes trapped and those carbon-based life forms, mainly plants, get converted into fossil fuels, they are holding on to that carbon. And a reservoir would be something like a tree or vegetation in the landscape. Don't forget the ocean. We're going to talk a lot about ocean and carbon cycle as well. A bigger player in terms of how much carbon is being stored in the deep ocean. So that gives you some idea of the key terms. So to begin with, we're going to talk about carbon. So what do we know? Carbon, most of the cycle is shifting between photosynthesis and aerobic respiration. You recall from biology, aerobic meaning oxygen is required and carbohydrates are oxidized through the process to produce ATP. That oxidation really after the post process of respiration produces carbon dioxide. So those are the two we could say natural inputs and outputs. Of course, we know humans are also contributing to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a key component of the carbon cycle. It makes up roughly 0.04% of the atmosphere. We know that in climate models, if we look at the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's directly correlated with higher temperature, and we can look at that through geological time. And we know that in real time, that's what's happening to our planet as we contribute more CO2 to the atmosphere. And inversely, less CO2 means colder temperatures. Very important, marine sediments store carbonates, things like limestones and other sedimentary rocks which accumulate over time, store lots of carbon and are a very important part of that. Up here, there's a model here showing combustion. So as we burn fossil fuels, we know that in this case, methane, CH4 combines with oxygen, produces two molecules of water, and produces carbon dioxide. So that's a basic model or diagram of what happens when we do combustion. And we know that is a big change in this natural cycle that humans have created, is releasing all that stored carbon that was down here in the fossil fuels and releasing it into the atmosphere. So that's the carbon cycle. We're going to talk a lot more about it as we talk about climate change. So nitrogen cycle, probably the most complex in terms of chemistry of the cycles. Natural inputs or outputs of nitrogen include things like volcanoes can release nitrogen. Very important is to know that nitrogen kind of wants to be in the atmosphere. It's the largest reservoir. About 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. It is not available, however, for living things in its form N2, which is inert. So consequently, microbes and microbes mainly in the soil play a huge role in converting that nitrogen, fixing that nitrogen, and allowing plants to accumulate it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here. So plants use mainly nitrogen in the form of three molecules: ammonia, which is NH3, ammonium ions, NH4, and nitrates, NO3, which are really important for plant growth and are a key component of agricultural fertilizers that allow us to produce lots of food in a small area. Lightning also plays a major role, you see here, in putting nitrogen into the soil. So what happens here? So here is a plant fixing nitrogen. So that would be in this diagram here, nitrogen fixing bacteria. These are legumes, and what legumes have is a commensal relationship with microbes on their roots. They're called mycorrhizal nodules, and they actually will extract that nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into oftentimes ammonium or ammonia, and that again can be converted through nitrification into nitrites, and then later into nitrate, which becomes assimilated into the plant. So spend some time learning some of these steps of the nitrogen cycle, and think about humans and how we might be contributing to more nitrogen getting in the atmosphere, and from emissions from combustion of gasoline. And we're going to get into that with air pollution, and also how we contribute to the amount of nitrogen getting into aquatic systems as we fertilize. All right, so in contrast to the nitrogen cycle, which is mainly an atmospheric cycle, I want to talk a little bit about the phosphorus cycle, which is mainly a sedimentary cycle. So phosphorus is also very important for plant growth, and it can be a limiting factor, especially for aquatic systems. So significant limiting factor, that's something that I want you to remember. And it's limiting, meaning it's not very readily available. And humans have produced lots of phosphorus or mined lots of phosphorus, and that is getting into especially aquatic systems and causing pretty significant algae growth, as we see in our Yahara lakes. Most of phosphorus is solid, um, and therefore there's no atmospheric phosphorus that we're going to talk about. They can get in the atmosphere, but quickly it usually is deposited, through deposition. The main reservoir where phosphorus is in the rocks and in sediment. Phosphorus is added to the system as quickly as weathering occurs on bedrock. But humans, like I mentioned, have been mining phosphorus, making it a key component of fertilizers, and those fertilizers are running off, as you can see in this diagram here, running off into streams and then getting into aquatic ecosystems. They're taken up by algae, which produce lots of biomass. And then what can happen is a lot of decomposition can occur because of all that organic matter, and that can have pretty significant detrimental impacts on aquatic systems, causing eutrophication, which we're going to talk about later, and anoxic conditions. So this is the main cause of this process called eutrophication, which essentially means aging of an aquatic system. Eutrophic lake is a lake that's been aged, and if it's culturally eutrophic, that means humans are the main driver of that process of accumulation of algae and sediment, and an aging of the lake. All right, so the hydrological cycle, we're probably pretty familiar with this one, the water cycle. Key component to remember is this is powered by the sun. So what drives rain, what drives rivers, eventually getting to the ocean, what keeps this cycle going? It's solar radiation. So the ocean makes up obviously the largest reservoir on Earth, well over 70% of our planet. Ice caps are and glaciers are the second most largest reservoir, and the largest reservoir of fresh water. And of course, those are shrinking as our planet warms. So last thing I want to talk about with the water cycle is realize that these cycles are not independent of each other. And of course, the water cycle and the phosphorus cycle are very connected, and especially the water cycle having big impact on the other cycles. So to recap very quickly, productivity and ultimately the abundance of life is dictated by these key nutrients. The carbon cycle centers around photosynthesis and aerobic respiration. Nitrogen requires microbes. And spend some time learning that nitrogen cycle and those steps, because they need to be distinguished. And those microbes help convert the nitrogen into usable compounds. Phosphorus is the slowest of the cycles, and its compounds are in the smallest amounts, making them a very important limiting factor for plant growth, and that can have major impacts on aquatic ecosystems. Here we have a diagram kind of breaking down a little bit of that nitrogen cycle. This might be helpful for you as you draw your pictures, is to maybe add some things like an animal or plant to kind of remember what exactly is happening as we look at these cycles. And don't forget, the hydrological cycle helps drive most of the other cycles. As mentioned earlier, when we talked about phosphorus, that erosional process and surface runoff on agriculture is causing a lot of that phosphorus to get into aquatic systems. All right, I'm going to give you a couple examples, and that's it. So it's a stormy Monday. I want to talk a little bit about humans' influence cycles. One is the water cycle. I'm outside in my front yard here. You can see behind me some a driveway and a road out there, impervious surface. So humans create these surfaces and greatly change how the water cycle operates. Water hits that surface and then it washes down into a drain and then out into a water system, versus over here in my front yard I have lots of plants that are taking that water and gathering that water in their roots and it percolating down into the ground. That water is going to hopefully filter as it passes through. So here we have a couple pine trees in my backyard. These are reservoirs of carbon stored in the wood. You can see these trees are pretty good size, storing lots of carbon for probably just a couple hundred years before this tree will fall and that carbon will be released in the atmosphere. Some of that carbon, however, might be stored and stored in the roots, and possibly becoming a sink of carbon if enough time happens and pressure. And here's my chicken. This is Patty. Patty makes lots of nitrogen rich and phosphorus rich waste which can be used in the garden. So an important component of the biogeochemical cycle of nitrogen is the role of legumes. Here I have wild sienna, which is a legume, and I can identify it by these bean pods and this compound leaf. So if you are familiar with most beans, most peas, these are all legumes, and farmers in fact do use those in crop rotation to improve the soil fertility. And what this organism has is a mutualistic relationship with a bacteria that live on the roots, and that bacteria fixes nitrogen. In return, it gets sugar compounds, carbohydrates from the plant, and the plant is able to absorb that nitrogen. And so much nitrogen is produced in some cases, obviously, that it improves the overall fertility of the soil.